We've just welcomed everybody in.
Okay, I'll give everybody a minute to join. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to give everyone a minute to join. I think we have a number of attendees today, so it might take a few minutes for everyone to log in. Just give people a minute. Okay, I think we can get started at this point. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today for an update on the grant funding formula. Just to give a little bit of a preview of the structure of our engagement today is we will have a presentation. The team from Third Sector is here to share some of our findings from the first 6 months of the grant, and we will then discuss where we're thinking about going for the next 6 months. And we will also have an opportunity to provide feedback through a survey. So unlike some of our other engagements where we've used a poll everywhere during the live engagement, we will not have that type of a engagement. We will turn everybody to a survey at the end of this presentation. And this presentation will be recorded so that it can be posted on the website. And this will allow anybody who is unable to attend today to both see the presentation and then also participate in the same way. There is a Q&A function that is part of the webinar. You certainly are welcome to enter questions into the Q&A. If we are able to answer them in real time, we certainly will. But in many cases, I think what we will do is take those questions back and find other opportunities to provide information and answers to those questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Lambert from Third Sector to jump into their findings.
Great. Thank you, Jocelyn. And thank you everyone for taking some time in your day to join. So today, as Jocelyn said, we're going to walk through a few pieces. So first, we're just going to start out with a review of how the current C3 funding formula works. Again, that's Commonwealth Cares for Children. I know this is likely familiar to many of you now, since hopefully you've been applying and receiving funding these past months, but just want to make sure we're all grounded in understanding of the current formula. Then we want to share a bit of what EUC has learned from these past few months of the funding rolling out and where the funding's going and what we're learning about how the formula is working. And then finally, want to talk about the extension of C3 funding into the first 6 months of next year, as well as the addition of a workforce bonus that providers can qualify for that we'll discuss more at the end. So hopefully, I think for many of you, we are some familiar faces from Third Sector now, but just to let you all know who we are and our role in this process, we're a nonprofit based here in Boston, and we work across a number of states across their early care and education systems, but are particularly proud of this work here in our home state and really excited to be part of this work here in the Commonwealth. And you can see my team members here on video, Tasha and HK, are a big part of this effort as well. And so just as a reminder, the Commonwealth Cares for Children C3 funding formula is what's being used to distribute the federal stabilization grants from the American Rescue Plan and the prior CRSA stimulus bill from December. And this is all operating in addition to current state funding. So just to underline that again, this isn't impacting subsidy payments or influencing current state funding. This is all supplemental and additional. And then just want to also provide a reminder of the guiding principles that went into forming this work. So you can see these here, but really focused on stability and adequacy, making sure this funding was of sufficient amount and structured in a way that was best suited to help providers maintain financial stability through this very difficult time. And alongside that, also trying to make this simple to apply for and continue to apply for, through the monthly recertifications, so that the money gets out into the field and doesn't create a heavier burden than necessary on providers. And then finally, something we'll certainly get into today is a real focus around equity and supporting all early education care providers, and then recognizing the unique needs of those providers who are serving historically marginalized communities and families of color. So now I'll just walk through a review of how the formula is currently working, just so we all have a shared understanding as we look at some of the results from the first 5 or 6 months here of the funding. But as a reminder, every program is eligible for this base amount that you see here on the left. And this is really designed to compensate providers for a relatively standard proportion of their cost of care. And you can see that this base amount is based on the license capacity of a program, so not enrollment, recognizing there's still significant challenges to maintaining full enrollment across the system, and wanting to make sure that this funding is really helping providers get back to that full enrollment and maintain their capacity. And it's also adjusted based on the number of educators in the program. And the thought there is that adjusting the size of the payments based on the number of educators means that providers that serve younger children, offer longer hours of care, or offer higher quality care, all of those types of programs would receive additional funding, recognizing the increased cost of care of doing those things. And then, so that's what all providers are eligible to receive. And then some providers receive the equity adjustment, which are additional funds for programs that are serving under-resourced children and families. And we'll get into a bit more detail on both of those pieces. So here's just an explanation of how that staffing adjustment works. And again, looking at the base amount that starts with $83 a month for every licensed slot. So based on that capacity, not enrollment, for family childcare providers, using 10 as the license, as the input into the formula, regardless of the actual license capacity, just for simplicity's sake. And then the staffing adjustment, this shows here how that's calculated. But again, really the idea is providing more funding for providers who have more educators on staff, who are offering longer hours and have the capacity to enroll younger children. Then the equity adjustment, there are 2 tiers of the equity adjustment. So the first level is a 30% additional funding, and the second level is 40% additional funding. And so you can see here that this is, there are 2 ways to qualify for the equity adjustment. One is based on where the program is located, and that's using this, you can see here SVI, that's the Social Vulnerability Index, and that's from the CDC, maintains this and calculates that, and it's a score for every census tract across the state. And so based on where a program is located, if the SVI score is between 0.55 and 0.75, that qualifies for level 1 of the equity adjustment. And if it's greater than 0.75, that will qualify for level 2. The other way to qualify for the equity adjustment is based off of the proportion of children in the program receiving subsidies. So you can see here that if between 1/3 and 2/3 capacity is filled with children receiving subsidies, that qualifies for level 1. And if more than 2/3 capacity is filled with children receiving subsidies, that qualifies for level 2. So now with kind of that background and refresher, would like to go into what EUC has learned from these first 6 months. And so first, just want to show the take-up rates of the funding across the system. So this is showing the proportion of providers who have applied for funding. And so you can see that this is really great news that so many providers have applied for funding. If you look in this farthest left column, you can see that 3/4 of center-based providers have applied for funding, and almost 80% of family childcare providers have applied for funding. And beyond that, I think something that's really encouraging is that when we look at those providers who are serving some of the historically marginalized communities and communities of color, we see even higher take-up rates. And so you can see that almost 90% of family childcare providers that are operating in census tracts with majority people of color residents have applied for the funding. Similarly high percentages in the gateway cities and communities with a very high social vulnerability index score. And we also see that those programs that receive subsidies and are perhaps used to dealing with EC and navigating state funding systems, those programs also have a significantly higher application rate. So this slide is showing where funding is going, broken down by these different characteristics. And so you can see here that for family childcare homes, are about excuse me, there are about 17% of the licensed slots in the system that are receiving about 20% of the C3 funding. And that really reflects the purposeful investment that EEC has made in family childcare homes through this funding, understanding the real importance of family childcare providers to communities of color and historically marginalized communities. You can also see a similar trend if we look at gateway cities or the highest SBI communities, seeing that receiving additional funding, disproportionate and beyond what we would expect just based on the proportion of licensed slots in the system that are in those communities. And again, that's really showing that additional level of investment driven by the equity adjustment into those communities. This is taking a slightly different look at that and instead looking at the typical funding amount per slot that different types of providers are receiving. So you can see that this is using the median, so kind of right in the middle, that typical provider. There's going to be providers that are higher and lower than this, but wanted to give you a sense of what that typical provider looks like. The typical family childcare provider gained $175 per month per licensed slot, and the typical center-based provider gained $163 per month per slot. But you can see that there's a real difference between those center-based providers that are serving infants and toddlers and those who are not. And again, this was something that was intentionally built into the formula, recognizing that serving infants and toddlers brings additional costs, and that type of care is just in such high demand. And so it is so important across the Commonwealth right now. And so you can see that those providers that are serving infants and toddlers and have those lower educator-child ratios are receiving significantly more funding per month per slot. This is focusing in on just those family childcare providers and looking to see how the equity adjustment is functioning. And so you can see that, in comparison to if we look across all family childcare providers, we're seeing $175 per month per slot. But then those providers that are operating in communities with majority people of color residents, operating in gateway cities, operating in high SBI communities are all receiving additional funding per month per slot. And thanks to the data you've all reported through the application, we can also see that those providers that are owned and operated by people of color are receiving additional funding above average per month per slot as well. So this is all an indication that that equity adjustment is working as intended to direct additional funds towards those historically marginalized communities and towards providers that are owned and operated by people of color. Here are the numbers for center-based providers. And again, I think this tells a really similar story of the equity adjustment functioning as intended and directing additional funds towards those priority communities. You can also see here again that breakdown between those providers that do not serve infants and toddlers and those that do, reflecting the intent of the staffing adjustment to make sure that those providers that are serving younger children are receiving additional funds to recognize that higher cost of care. But here again, you can see that, based on where providers are located, as well as if providers are owned and operated by people of color, that they're receiving additional funds above and beyond kind of the average amount. So I'll pass over to you, Jocelyn, to get into some of the other data from the survey and the applications.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. So for programs, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, that recertified for November, we did take the opportunity to add some additional survey questions to the grant application process to get a little bit more information about how funds have been spent, as well, and some more detailed information about enrollment and staffing issues that programs are experiencing, as well as a few other questions. To conduct the analysis for this presentation, we did pull data on November 27th when we had a little under 90% of those applying responding to the survey. So we felt like we had high enough response rates to use the data, but to still allow ourselves the time to do some of the analysis that we wanted to do. And I think high level, what we found from looking at the survey spending data is that providers are using the grant funds to fund both operational expenses, but also to try to find ways to invest in their educators and the quality of their programs. And for a little context, I just want to call out what everybody here knows. Challenges with enrollment continue in the field. When we look at enrollment numbers, we do see increases in enrollment from July to November, but at the same time, those numbers are not at full capacity. And we also do see that there's significant numbers of part-time children reported in the survey. So when you adjust for part-time enrollment, we're estimating that on average programs that are at about 60%, 68% of their full-time enrollment. So that clearly reflects a restriction on revenue that programs can expect, and puts additional financial pressure on programs. And I think when we look at how programs are using the grant funding, we do see that 95% of programs are reporting using the funding immediately to sustain operations. And when we focus in specifically on how those funds are being used by programs, we see that the typical grant fund budget, programs are using about 3/4 of their grant money to fund different types of operational costs. Some of those are past expenses that they're allowed to reimburse themselves with the grant. In some cases, this is covering their existing payroll or other operational expenses, fixed costs associated with space, utilities, and things like that. At the same time, we do also see that roughly a third of the grant funds that have been expended so far are being put into new expenses, increasing compensation through both increases to salaries as well as one-time bonuses and other investments in program quality, such as additional trainings and materials and supplies that are needed. And I think this reflects programs' desire to both address the quality issues in the program, but also, recognizing the need to use the funding to maintain operations. When we dig in a little bit more deeply in terms of the types of salary increases that are being provided, we are seeing that 27% of programs are reporting those types of increases. So not every program is able to spend the funds that way, but certainly programs that are able to find ways to do that are appreciating the use of the funds for that purpose. When we asked programs about the need for the grant in future months, we found that 94% of programs reported that they will need the grant to cover operational expenses over the next 3 months. So this ongoing need to stabilize program finances continues. And we also did hear from 11% of programs that they are in danger of closing in the next 6 months if they do not continue to receive funding. And this is especially true for smaller programs and programs that are reporting lower enrollment, which I think is not surprising. Can you go to the next slide, Jeff? The other component of the dynamic right now that programs are trying to manage, and I think increases the need and the desire to invest in the workforce, is persistent workforce challenges. 69% of programs report that they currently have educator openings. And on average, this comes out to about 3 open positions per program. So, I mean, this reflects significant gaps in the program staffing across the field, which also further restricts enrollment, because if programs do not have enough staff for to cover a classroom, that classroom has to be closed. And then that is a group of children that just cannot be served by the program. When we look at the total of how many positions are open in context of the overall number of staff being reported currently by programs, we're seeing that these openings reflect about 12% of programs' current educator staffing. And this seems to be true across the state geographically. There are no differences from what we could tell in the data from communities in high SVI areas, for example, or lower SVI areas. We also do hear from programs that they are looking at ways in which they can increase compensation as one tool to continue to sustain educators and sustain their staffing. Over 70% of programs report that they do plan to increase salaries by the end of the fiscal year, and there's another 30% that's planning to do so before the end of the calendar year. But in the context in which we've been looking, we recognize that this reflects a situation where programs are still managing restricted revenue and also trying to increase the outlay in compensation. So we do see that over half of the educators are using grant funds to support compensation expenses, both looking ahead to covering payroll as well as thinking about one-time bonuses. And when you look at each program's grant budget, you see that about 30% of these funds are being used to cover benefits and wages. We also see that almost a third of programs are looking to use the grant funds to cover longer term salary increases. And interestingly, we're seeing that when we look at the staffing adjustment itself, which reflects the number of educators per licensed slot, has actually increased by almost 0.5 FT, it's about 0.4. But at the same time, we see decreases in the total number of classrooms opening. So again, I think these are the numbers that reflect some of the consolidations that we have heard that programs are doing, whereby there are not enough educators and classrooms are being closed. Can you go to the next slide? So recognizing that, and also hearing the feedback from the field, that we have heard that funds are really needed to continue to stabilize operation as well as supporting recruitment and retention. Programs have said really thankful for the money. It is definitely helping to stabilize the field. We're impressed at how EEC got the formula out in a very short amount of time. Kudos for that. And this was a substantial amount of money. It has really made an impact, but also recognizing that the 6-month timeline has been a challenge for programs. The fact it is going to end has made it difficult to know what to do with the funds. And some providers are sitting on it. We want to see it go out, but we're worried about the loss of enrollment and uncertainty. We wanted to look ahead to what we could do with the funds over the rest of the fiscal year to address some of the issues and challenges that we're seeing in the field. So the first step that is important is we will continue to fund programs using the same formula that we have been using over the next half of the fiscal year. So this grant fund will be now, and originally was planned as a 6-month grant, and is now a 12-month grant that will run through June of 2022. All existing grant recipients will be able to just go in and recertify your application in January, as you always have. There should not be any changes to the process for those that have already been receiving the grants. The other piece of good news is that we will be able to extend eligibility to programs that were licensed or funded after March 11th. So this would allow us to continue to fund EEC licensed programs that were licensed after March 11th, or private school run funded programs that engaged in an agreement with the EEC after March 11th. So certainly I know we've received a lot of questions about that limitation to eligibility, which was tied to federal regulations connected to the funding source we were using, and we are able to open that up. We are also, as we've spoken about in other engagements, working on an online professional registry. And when that launches, we also hope that that will simplify the reporting process, because it will allow us, it will reduce the amount of staff information that needs to be entered directly into the grant application itself. And we can begin using that information to populate that part of the grant application. And that should reduce burden on those applying. Can you go to the next slide? So in addition to extending the current grant formula, we are looking to design an additional bonus payment to launch in the spring in support of educator recruitment and retention. Because again, back to the tension that we're hearing from programs, we recognize these grant funds are needed to support operations, but then also needed to support programs in recruitment and retention. And we do want to provide funding to programs that are finding ways to successfully retain their existing workforce, as well as implement successful recruiting strategies. So the plan is to add an additional $15 to a slot, to the starting per slot amount for programs that meet criteria that we are in the process of defining, and we'll get into some questions that we have to support us in defining how that criteria work. But effectively that amount would be added to the base amount, if you remember back to Jeff's original presentation of how the grant formula works. And then the staffing adjustment and the equity adjustment would be based on that additional base amount. We are also looking to support programs that want to invest in meaningful increases in benefit structures. So we recognize that increasing salaries is not the only way to attract staff and retain staff, but benefits also matter. And we recognize that for FCCs, this isn't necessarily something that working with an assistant that every FCC does. And it is a place where many FCCs have been very responsive to families and have done many things like increasing hours, providing increased infant toddler care, and other family-centered offerings that have been really important to making programs accessible to families, similar to the work that center-based providers have been doing to keep educators in place to keep their offerings available to families. And we do also want to recognize those investments in a different way for FCC educators. Go to the next slide. So at this point, we are looking to feedback and thinking about how we are designing the workforce bonus to support programs' unique recruitment and retention challenge. We are trying to further support programs in managing the costs that are associated with providing high quality and responsive education and care for families. So we recognize that the ability to hire and retain staff in center-based programs is really central to the program's ability to be open and accessible and available for families. It allows for longer hours, more infant and toddler classrooms, and lower ratios for quality. So on the center-based side, we're really focusing the bonus on the educator side of the component and the recruitment and retention side. And again, as mentioned for FCCs, we recognize that educators support families directly in many ways that don't always rely on additional staff, and also want to ensure such costs are accounted for, like the longer hours that might be provided, non-standard hours for families like early mornings and overnight care, as well as a potential focus on infants and toddlers. And the questions that we have open are, we really do want to understand, get some feedback that will help us shape the criteria that will be used to determine how FCC and center-based providers should qualify for the workforce bonus, as well as thinking about the data that we should be collecting to validate the criteria. And Jeff, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Jocelyn. So as Jocelyn was saying, there's clearly many more questions to be answered here around how exactly this workforce bonus is designed. We really want it to be designed in a way that is supportive of all of your operations for both center-based and family childcare programs. And we want to make sure it's done in a way that gives you the flexibility you need to make decisions about your business in a way that allows you to recruit and retain qualified early educators. And so in support of that, ESC will be posting a survey that will be open through January, so seeking to get people's input when they have time and are available to get a better understanding of some of these key questions that are going to inform how the bonus is designed. And so you can see that for center-based programs, some of the themes that you'll see in the survey are trying to better understand, what are you doing now to support recruitment and retention? We know how high a priority this has been for the field, and we know that all of you already have strategies in place and want to understand what's currently happening so that this bonus can best support that. We also want to understand what the current results are and how you think about your goals around recruitment and retention. Better understanding what would help you and what supports you would need around both retention and hiring, as well as what you would do with additional funding and where you think there's opportunities for investment that would increase your ability to recruit and retain qualified educators. And then for family childcare programs, aligned with those open questions we shared on the previous slide, trying to understand which program characteristics should really be the basis of this bonus and qualify programs for additional funding, and are there other characteristics that should be considered that really reflect the quality of your program and what you're offering to families, knowing that there's so many different ways that family childcare providers support families. And then finally, just on both fronts, understanding what else you'd like us to consider and making sure that there's some open space to really share and make sure that you're able to communicate anything that you see as a risk or as an opportunity around the design of these bonuses. And so since I know this is scheduled for an hour, but it is wrapping up early, I think we will post the survey in the chat and hope that you could take some time now to fill that out while we have some time and you have a little bit of time back in your day. And it would also be great if you could, help us get this word out and send this around, send the link to other providers that you're in contact with, if there's groups you're part of or Facebook groups where you want to post it. Just be really great to make sure this gets out as widely as possible. It's meant to take less than 15 minutes. It's going to be open, through the holidays into January. We know it's a really busy time of year, but hope that people will be able to find time over the next couple of weeks. This will all be really helpful information and directly inform how this workforce bonus is designed in the spring.
And I just want to add, I'm getting a couple of questions about the specifics of the requirements for the bonus structure. Will it include increases in salaries as well as increases in bonuses? I just want to reiterate, we are designing that now, and that is the feedback that we want to hear from you. Like, what do you want us to make sure that we consider when we look at how we design this bonus? We recognize that you have many tools in your toolbox to attract educators. And when we were working through our options and thinking about how to design the bonus, we wanted to do it in a way that gives programs flexibility and thinking about what are the most important and useful tools to use to do this, and started to think about highlighting the types of outcomes that we were looking for rather than the mechanisms. But the details are essential to this process. And so please use the survey as an opportunity to give us our feedback on what we should be paying attention to and accounting for. And yes, we will publicize the fact that this both the video and the survey are available on the engagement website. So that will go out in the commissioner's email. We will use, sort of all the different communication channels we have to make sure that the field is aware of this. And again, it will be available through January. So there's a fair amount of time for people to join in. We would like the broadest engagement that we can get as possible. And if you didn't catch the link, I believe the link will also be available on the engagement website. So you can certainly go back there to find it. So I would like to thank everybody for your participation, and we look forward to hearing the results, and we'll absolutely continue to find ways to communicate about the development of this work. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon. I think please go and fill out the survey. We've given you a little extra time for that, and we will wrap this up now. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.